UCCF's BeThinking website, bethinking.org, offers you free access to some of the finest apologetics resources in the world. Make sure you sign up as a BeThinker to receive our monthly email. The BeThinking email is packed with handy information highlighting new articles, film, book and music reviews, and is filled with practical examples of how you can make good use of the excellent and insightful material on bethinking.org to help you grow as a thinking Christian. BeThinkers combine a good understanding of the issues with a character that shows that the biblical truths that the BeThinker describes are authentic and life-changing. Log on to bethinking.org and become a BeThinker today.
I think we probably better start, hadn't we? On the basis that you are they who have come. And it's 4:10, isn't it? Why don't we just start? And let me just remind you of where we got. I had been telling you this little illustration of C.S. Lewis, which I found very helpful in explaining what laws are and what they're not. And the story was of 2 + 2 = 4. If you put $2 plus $2 in your drawer at night and you find 1, the next day you don't say the laws of arithmetic are broken, you say the laws of whatever country you're in have been broken. And what I didn't mention yesterday is this helps illustrate too the difference between the scientific use of the word law and the legal use of the word law, because there's no sense in which the arithmetic constrains this new thief. That would be absurd. And I know it's a simple analogy, but sometimes they can be very helpful in getting across ideas. Just like Newton's law of gravitation tells me if I drop an apple, it will fall towards the center of the earth. But the law doesn't prevent someone intervening and catching it as it falls. In other words, what we're saying is that the law predicts what will happen. It's not simply a description of what normally happens. It has a certain predictive dimension to it. It will predict what will happen, provided there's no change in the condition under which the experiment is conducted. That's the crucial thing. So, from a theistic perspective, what have we? We have that the laws of nature predict what is bound to happen if God does not intervene. Although, of course, it's no act of theft if the Creator intervenes in his own creation. And so I would want to argue that to say that the laws of nature make it impossible for us to believe in the existence of God and the possibility of his intervention in the universe is plainly fallacious. It would be something like saying that because we understand the laws of internal combustion, that makes it impossible to believe that the designer of a motor car or one of his mechanics could or would intervene and remove the cylinder head. Of course they could. And the intervention wouldn't destroy the laws, because the laws would now explain why the thing didn't work now when it did work in the first place. So it's misleading, therefore, to say with Hume that miracles violate the laws of nature. And I much prefer the formulation, we can discuss it in a moment, that God feeds new events into the system from time to time. And the quote from C.S. Lewis that I've got down here, I think is very helpful. I use it quite a lot. If God annihilates or creates or deflects a unit of matter, he has created a new situation at that point. Immediately all nature domiciles this new situation, makes it at home in a realm, adapts all other events to it. It finds itself conforming to all the laws. If God creates a miraculous spermatozoon in the body of a virgin, it does not proceed to break any laws. The laws at once take over. Nature is ready. Pregnancy follows according to all the normal laws. And 9 months later, a child is born. So that kind of way of looking at it, I think, is enormously helpful. And if we apply it to the resurrection, I mean, after all, in apologetics, we're often dealing with the central question of the resurrection. You might say that it's a law of nature that human beings do not rise again from the dead by some natural mechanism. You see? And it's good to say that. It's a law of nature, and listen carefully how I formulate it, that people do not rise from the dead by some natural mechanism. But Christians do not claim that Christ rose from the dead by a natural mechanism. They claim that he rose from the dead by supernatural power. And the laws of nature by themselves cannot rule out that possibility. And it's interesting to notice where the New Testament describes the resurrection of Christ. It describes an injection of colossal power from outside, which is exactly what you would expect. It is not done by some natural process.
Just to interject there.
Yes, please, Peter, go ahead. Thank goodness for an interjection.
To confirm that point, if you read William Lane Craig's defense of the resurrection, he makes exactly the same point and says, I'm going to argue for the truth claim that God raised Jesus from the dead. I'm not going to argue for the truth claim that Jesus rose from the dead, because that's highly implausible.
Yeah.
Not by natural means.
Well, that's an even better way of putting it. And we should say what Peter said. Do read Bill Craig on this stuff. I mean, he is absolutely excellent. Absolutely excellent. He's one of the foremost, I think, defenders of this. And read Jürgen, and if you can't read Jürgen, talk to Jürgen about the resurrection too. Okay, and to sum up as well what we were saying, when a miracle takes place, it's the laws of nature that alert us to the fact that it is a miracle. It's our knowledge of the regularities that says, aha, here is something that's happened that's not within the regularity. So it becomes a sign in the technical sense. It points to something special having heard. So it's very important to grasp that Christians do not deny the laws of nature. Hume seems to suggest that they do. It's an essential part of Christianity, as I see it, to believe in the laws of nature's descriptions of the regularities, the cause-effect relationships that are built in to the universe by its creator and according to which it normally operates. If we didn't know that, we'd never recognize a miracle if we saw one. Are we all with that? Any other comments on this at this point? Yes, Peter.
Before your lecture, we heard in another lecture about the violation of the laws of nature. It was American. It was surprising me.
But that must have been in a parallel universe. Yes, Adam.
I don't know whether you agree with it, but I would say also that somehow the law of nature are also not absolute, which we can say exists next to God. But the God, because I mean, it is not only that, at least it is not, because here, for example, you just give examples when God make it very short, for example, even with his Parmesan and Mary, is, let's say, short, but it could be even longer. I mean, when you think about Moses as he keeps his hands up and the sunshine still...
Yes.
So somehow, it's hard to explain, but somehow God can... This act could be prolonged, or we can stop.
Oh, certainly.
So it is not only the...
What I think what you're saying, let me try and tease out what I think you're saying. You're saying that a miracle in itself needn't be a split-second occurrence, but it could be something that occurs over a long time, of course.
Yeah, so, but in the sense that there is God, and then there are these natural laws, which do not have a really basis, except God, because what is also maybe very positive from Hume, that he actually shows that if there is not God, there's actually not basis to believe in natural laws. Because there's in the same sense as without God, there's not a sense to believe in causal principle.
In what?
In causal principle.
In causal principle. Well, of course, Hume didn't believe in that, as far as we could see.
So I agree, without God, so somehow the God is somehow keeping the natural law and the causal principle. And we can ask why actually, maybe because he wants, as you mentioned somehow, to leave us a signs, some signs of irregularities. Because we can ask why actually not, because we can expect also that God can, I mean, as Pentecostal, maybe I hope that charismatic, strong charismatic, we would like to believe that God, on every our request will change it as often as they want. But even the best charismatic one day will die.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I believe so. I mean, so it means simply that it is simply that he's limited, that he keeps the laws going.
Is what you're suggesting, I mean, I'm interested to get the bottom of this. Perhaps others understand better what you're saying. Is what you're talking about the fact that we tend to think of, say, creation. God said, let there be light. There was light. That's a miracle. That's God intervening. He creates something out of nothing. But we should not forget that the maintenance of the whole universe in being is equally well dependent on God. And if he stopped existing, so to speak, the universe would stop existing. Is that what you're saying? That the regularities themselves at another level are held in place by God, and in a sense that is a miracle.
Yeah, I'm saying that I believe in, or let's say, believe somehow in these regularities only because of God.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Of the science, or not of the, I don't know, any, because science that doesn't give me such a basis.
Oh, that's right. Well, that's what I was talking about this morning. Which one?
Because Lewis makes this very point. He says, if you believe in a faithful God who sustains the universe, that gives you a reason to believe that there's a rational order that will be faithfully continued. Whereas if everything is just a result of chaos, then it might all suddenly change.
Yeah.
But if you believe in a faithful God who might do something in a different way from time to time for a good enough reason, then you also can't rule out miracles. Mm-hmm. So the very idea that gives you a basis for believing that there are laws that are reliable also shows that those laws are not absolutes.
Oh, that's right, Peter. That's actually, we were discussing that in my lecture this morning, and why science suddenly exploded in the 16th, 17th century, because the monotheistic background gave exactly that basis. That you've got a stable universe, you've got a rational order. The rational order sits very uncomfortably with the materialistic background, chaos, randomness, and so on, but sits perfectly well with the notion that there is a creator, God, who imposed it and maintained it. But at the same time, it gives you exactly... So theism, in the biblical sense, actually gives you everything, which is marvelous. Now, does anybody else want to make a comment? Yes, Alexander.
What would you say to a person, which happened to me, and he told me, I don't believe in God, I just believe in the universe, because I see the universe is trustworthy, and it's so regular, and I can build my life on the universe, because it's so regular and trustworthy, but God is just so, I cannot grasp him. He's not trustworthy. Is that rather a theological problem? He's a wrong picture of God.
It's a very interesting thing to say. Well, let's have some other reactions first. Let's see, all these experts in the room.
How you can ask him, how you can what's the ground for regularity? I mean, universe is irregular. Why is it regular? What's wrong with this regular?
We see that it's regular, so our laws are valid in all areas that we have seen right now.
But generally you also see chaos. And as it was mentioned, for example, they believe in chaotic motion. Yeah, the belief is chaotic. Why there are regularities?
But still you see regularity in the chaos. Or you
But
can...
the deterministic chaos.
Yeah.
Not in normal chaos. Not in chaotic chaos.
We have not the mathematics for our physics.
There is the problem of induction from Hume, obviously, but just to say, because my past experience of the universe has been that it is regular, to what extent does that justify the predictive saying, well, it will be regular tomorrow on Hume's principles? He says, you can't tell if the second sun's going to rise tomorrow. At least if I believe in a faithful God, I can say, well, unless God's got some special reason for doing things differently, then the sun will rise tomorrow. So that does give a rational basis for the predictive reliability of thinking that nature will be.
Yeah, that's right. And we're going to come on to that uniformity of experience in a minute. I think, Alexander, my immediate reaction to that situation, although it would depend for me who was saying it, I would say, what do you mean by trusting the universe? For what? What is it giving you? What's the sense of meaning that it gives to you? Because usually we talk about trusting persons. Well, the universe consists of a whole lot of lumps of material plus millions of people plus all kinds of structures. What do you mean by trusting the universe? And then raise the question of whether the universe itself points beyond itself. Because I would have thought that the universe was a very poor sort of thing to begin to trust, because your experience of the universe tells you that after a finite time, you're going to die. Is that the total significance of everything? So it's an odd thing. Jürgen, you wanted to say something?
The problem are the people. I think I can trust the universe, think the basis for my life. The problem are other people. I cannot trust other people.
Yes, now that's a different way of formulating it, if that's the case, yes.
That's the problem. And the next point would be if I have problems with pain and such things,
yes.
I have to go in the hospital. In such a situation, does it mean to trust the universe? But in normal life, I can trust the universe. Newspapers coming these days, or trust the universe.
I think it would raise the distinction between saying that the universe is predictable and saying that the universe is trustworthy.
Yes.
Those are two different things.
But if a thing is predictable, then it's where I can put my life. As long as I'm in good health.
Ah, yes. Yes.
And without cycle, thanks to you.
Yeah, it's actually, I think Jürgen is pointing to something that I found very useful. And that is, if a person's philosophy only helps them when life's going well, it's not much good. And so I would want to push on the side of, that sounds wonderful. But now what happens if you discover you've got cancer? The universe has given it to you, has it? Going to trust the universe to cure you or kill you? See, what does it mean? Analyze it a bit further. Okay? Well, look, let's move on to the second aspect of this argument. This is page 2, by the way, if you've got it, page 2, if you haven't. Hume's argument for the uniformity of experience. You see, the popular notion, a miracle, is an exception to what normally happens. In ordinary language, that seems to be fair enough. If they were more normal, they wouldn't be called miracles. And it's there that Hume comes in with his discussion of uniform experience. What does he mean by it? And it seems to me there are two possibilities. It's one thing to say experience shows that such and such normally happens, but there may be exceptions, although none has been observed. That is, the experience we have had has been uniform. And that's very important, that you have to ask, what do you mean by experience, uniform experience? And frequently it's experience we have had. So it is limited by that. It's a completely different thing to say, this is what we normally experience, and we must always experience it, for there can be and are no exceptions. So the distinction needs to be made very clearly between giving an absolute uniform experience to which there can be no exceptions, and to say, right, our experience up to the moment, which is finite, has been that so far as we can say, there have been no exceptions to this particular thing. We have never observed a resurrection, for example. But the odd thing is that Hume, with all his intelligence, seems to go for the second rather than the first. A miracle is something that has never been experienced before, for if it had been, you could no longer call it a miracle. Which is a very arbitrary statement. Why can there not have been a succession of miracles in the past? What he does, as far as I can see in analysing his argument, is he assumes what he wants to prove, namely that there have never been any miracles in the past. So there is uniform experience against this present instance being a miracle. But his argument runs into very serious trouble at this point. How does he know? That's the basic question. How does he know? In order to know that your experience against miracles is absolutely uniform, you'd need to have access to every event in the universe at all times and places, which is self-evidently impossible. And it would simply seem that he's forgotten that humans have only ever observed a tiny fraction of the sum total of events which have occurred, and very few of those that have been observed have been written down. So he can't know that miracles have not taken place. So it's a question-begging thing, but there is a way out of the circularity of this, and that's to be open to the possibility that miracles have occurred, which is a historical question and not a philosophical one. And it depends on witness and on evidence. Would the historians agree among us?
Yes. Once I was in a discussion with a physicist, and he was asked what he physicist thinks about miracles. He was discussing about religious teams, and he said that he as a physicist is not competent to say anything about miracles. If you want to find out whether a miracle had happened or not, you would have asked historians. For historians can tell you whether the witnesses are reliable or not, and that is a crucial point. And I found that this physicist was very right.
Yeah. Well, that's very good. Thanks, Jürgen. This is extremely important because that physicist clearly had a very clear sense of the limitations of science. Very unusual, actually, and also unusual that he would give credit to the importance of historians in dealing with that kind of a situation.
Of course, the birth of science is in some way predicated on the idea that you can't tell what is true about the world simply sitting in your armchair and thinking in that chair. You actually have to go and look and see. So I think you can always argue, it's a very unscientific attitude to take towards miracles, to say, well, no, they can't happen, so I'm not going to bother looking at the evidence.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Peter. That actually is a very important thing in the whole general discussion, to be aware of that colossal shift, which I suppose Galileo is one of the striking examples of. Instead of sitting in your armchair and saying, well, now, what is perfection? Perfection is a circle. Ergo, the planets must move in circles around the Earth. But they don't. But yes, we can add circles and circles and circles and epicycles and all the rest of it. So you start with a philosophical principle and you go out to impose on the universe a structure which is then starts to creak because some people like Galileo stick a telescope to their eye and look up and discover what Aristotle also predicted, that beyond the moon everything is perfection. And he discovered that the moon had little blotches on it and craters and things, and that shattered everything. But if I might make an aside comment here, Peter, do you know what I find very interesting today? That view is coming back. If you think about it, and it struck me, and it never struck me really before, that the shift from Aristotle to, if you like, Copernicus and so on, to experimentation, to looking at the universe and saying, what does the universe say, rather than imposing a philosophy, what are we going to say about when science appears to become applied naturalism?
Yes. I was going to say, it doesn't Darwin.
It's the very same thing. And it's very striking. It's going back to the pre-scientific way of thinking. You've got a philosophy, naturalism, and everything has now got to be forced to fit that grid. I find that quite interesting, actually. And I think it ought to be embarrassing for certain people. Does that make sense to you? Do you follow what I'm saying? That it's a philosophical principle that's now being forced through And I suppose the clearest expression of this is Richard Lewontin in his famous essay, which I hope you've all read, where he says that it's not that the methods of science force us into a materialistic way of asking questions, but rather that it's our pre-commitment to materialism that says that we must ask for materialistic answers. And then he concludes the paragraph by saying, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now that's refreshingly honest, but it's very much Aristotelian thinking, isn't it?
The thing is, naturalism limits the kind of explanatory category that you have. It says things must fit within that.
That's right.
Theism includes all the explanatory categories that naturalism gives you. It gives you more. It actually gives you
More options.
logically exhaustive list, I would say, of explanatory options.
Yes, I think that's right.
And therefore, you're freed up to just simply say, well, let's look at what the evidence says happened in each particular instance. But we don't have to constrain our explanations ever.
I mean, the problem with this is only that, I mean, generally people believe that if you have such an assumption as well, you will never do solid work. If you are too lazy, you need to look for the very end. I mean, I simply can understand the people why they don't really want to allow anything besides I mean, and probably I don't know whether it is possible science to I mean, from my point of view, I can imagine that we can. It is always which I read already the times here, that we can determine science and say science is solved. And there are some questions which are outside of science. At least for this moment.
Yeah.
We can build some physics.
Yes.
But we are not. But it's very, very hard. I mean to work out some principles which says after you've done those sort of you can now assume that it is a miracle or something supernatural here.
Yeah.
This, I mean, I really like this design or these theories, but I don't know somehow whether we can somehow really prove that there's no other chance. Simply this for me, I mean, I don't want to degrade these attempts or something, but simply I think maybe this tension we should accept it. There will be always this tension, and as long as we allow this tension, it's okay. It's the best situation when one side or the other side, I mean, calls the other one, you are stupid, and then just stop the discussion.
Well, the problem that you're facing is a very real one. And it is, to my mind, much more complex than some people allow. It's an aspect of the God of the gap situation. Because if you're a working scientist, as both of us are in that sense, you don't want your colleagues to say, well, you're a lazy man. You're intellectually lazy. All you're saying is, here's a situation, it's far too complicated for you to wrestle with. Therefore, God did it. It's some kind of a miracle. And you have to be some people, say that the God of the gaps is a very easy thing to answer. It is not an easy thing to answer in a practical situation. Because, and one or two of the things helped me, like I've mentioned this morning, I'll not go over them again, that there are situations where it's science itself that is opening up the gap. And if you can explain that to people, where the actual nature of the problem rises to the kind of level where, as in my example of the archaeologist, you see the scratches in the cave, and you make an immediate inference to something very much more complicated than the scratches. Because of their semiotic nature, they're carrying signs, they point beyond themselves. And when that question is raised with me by my colleagues, I said, now look, let's first get a sense of proportion. Most of science is concerned with studying how something works. It doesn't raise these questions at all, except in the sense that the more sophisticated and complex it is, for the theist responds and say, what a genius God is. Look how he's done that. And your understanding of it goes parallel with an increase in your admiration of the God who did it. There's no problem in that area, and that covers 99.9% of science. So we mustn't let people push us into a disproportionate corner. That's my first. Then I say, but there are certain areas where science itself, in the sense of applied naturalism, appears to struggle. Now, I want to know the significance of that struggle. By all means, try as hard as you can to give a naturalistic explanation. But what I want to suggest to you as a mathematician is this, that sometimes when we have tried to prove a mathematical conjecture for a long time and not succeeded, we then begin to ask, perhaps you can prove that it's false. Prove that it's false. So we begin to investigate the possibility that it's false. Now, it seems to me that one of the things that may save this problem in this very narrow area is to say, look, two questions. The first question I mentioned this morning, and it's this. Irrespective of mechanism, however it came to be, can you scientifically say that there's evidence of intelligent input there? That's one question. The other question is to really get clear on the possibility of a law of conservation of information, because then you're on safe ground. You see, conservation of energy law. If I write a paper that says, here is a perpetual motion machine, you would say, I'm not going to read it. But I say, you haven't read my mechanism, you don't know. But you'd say this is a proscriptive law. Many laws are descriptive and prescriptive, but conservation of energy is proscriptive. It forbids perpetual motion machines. And a suitably formulated law of conservation of energy, if one exists, and some people suggest there is one, I'm expressing myself very cautiously here, would say that if a situation involving information has information coming in at one end, and what you get out at the other end, if there's no additional information, is degraded information plus noise. That's what you mean by conservation. Then, without having investigated every conceivable mechanism, you can come to the conclusion that natural processes do not create information. Does that make sense to you? And that is the hope that I see in there. But I can sympathize with you, because it's all very well for people who are not working in science to think they've solved the God of the gaps problem. But the real practical problem is you are a lazy man. And once your colleagues get that impression, you've had it. So I sympathize very much. Well, let's go back to Hume here. Oh, sorry, Peter.
What's the assuming with the law of conservation of information? Which information is...
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Like energy. Okay, then what is information in your definition? The definition of Shannon or something?
Well, that's the next question. As you know, probably better than I do, one of the biggest problems in this area is how to get a clear definition scientifically of information that has got a semantic content.
You mean the semantic context of
Correct, absolutely.
because it says there is no law of conservation of information. In semantics, if it makes it statistically, it would be.
Yes, but even if you leave the semantics out and just take the simple Shannon-type information, that at least gets you a very long way. But I think one of the real problems is there, how can we quantify it? What would we mean by a closed system, for example? These are very, very difficult questions. And I think they're a very interesting thing for information theoreticians to work on. Very interesting. They're very difficult. Yes, oh, I know that. They've told me. But let's get back to the point that Jürgen made about this whole business of witnesses, because that's what we go on to do. And it's very interesting, actually, I found, to look at the whole question of the evidence for the resurrection through Hume's criteria, because he talks about witnesses. He says a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Well, that's very good. So we can cite Hume positively there. And then secondly, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavours to establish. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision, and always reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then and not until then can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. Now, having read that so far, can you see a way in which, or do you already use that kind of argument when you're presenting the case for the resurrection?
Yes.
Peter, give us an example.
A prime example of this is the way that Peter Creech and Morgan Selling argue for it in their
Unpack it for us.
They go through, you know, the classical trilemma about Jesus, given his claims, well, he was either lying or he was mad, or they were true, and, well, he doesn't seem to be mad, doesn't say he was a liar, so what does that leave you? But they do a similar thing for the resurrection, saying that the disciples who claimed that he died and that he was buried in his tomb, the tomb was empty, and they saw him afterwards, he was alive. Well, either they're lying their heads off, or they're deceived in some way. They think it's true, but it's not, or it's true. And they try to eliminate the two alternatives of, you know, they were lying their heads off for something that they were prepared to die for, and the Colosseums of Rome looked something that they knew they'd made it all up, highly implausible. Were they deceived? What are the plausible suggestions of deception? Someone stole the body from the tomb. You know, even liberal theologians don't hold to this kind of explaining away theory anymore, and so they try to leave the alternative as being one standing.
Yeah. The point is that Christians, Sir Norman Anderson did that similarly in his little book, The Evidence for the Resurrection, actually used Hume's criteria on the New Testament accounts of the resurrection. And that's a very powerful point to make. Because here, skeptical Hume, who's been responsible for so much of the negative attitude towards miracles, but he sets up a set of criteria for witnesses that he's prepared to take seriously, and is the kind of argument that Christians use. Now, we've heard Peter on it. Jürgen, you're the evidence historian man. Do you want to comment on this use of Hume's criterion when it comes to, are the disciples guilty of fraud or deception or not, and this kind of thing? Do you use arguments like that?
Yes, but it is the question, what is more probable, and it's the question of really the reliability of the witnesses in the Testament.
Yes.
The most important thing to discuss.
And how do you approach that?
I wrote that with another story which Tacitus is telling about Caesar Vespasian, and Tacitus is writing that Vespasian has healed two people and only laying his hand on these two people. And then Tacitus writes that it is hard to believe that this can be true. But there are witnesses for this event, and they tell it till today that they have seen it, that has happened, and these witnesses have no advantage of the message. And so he says, it seems that it was true. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that Bengtson, the most leading ancient historian in Germany in the last century, he had this passage in his handbook of Roman history. And he's saying, we cannot, 2,000 years later, say that could not be happened. For Tacitus has understanding of the problem. only has written Vespasian has healed 2 people, only laying hand of them, then people today would think, oh, maybe it's not it's an invention. But Tacitus really wrote, and it's hard to believe. So he has an understanding that there is a problem. It's not easy to believe. And I sometimes in the discussion tell this story to show that people in ancient times knew that there are things easy to believe and other things not so easy to believe. I'm not thinking that we today, we know sometimes are easy enough, and the people in former times had no problem with that. They had problems with healing and resurrection and these things, as we have today.
That's very helpful, and it's very useful, yes. Any other comments on this? And I mean, if we were to tease the thing out, we could apply this criterion straight away, as Peter was suggesting there, to the reliability of the disciples. What is the probability of them having perpetuated a deliberate fraud? And you take that seriously, you say, well, then that means that they were deliberately deceiving. Now, what was their message? It was a message of truth. They gave their lives for it. Is it credible that they would give their lives for a message that they knew to be false? And then you say, well, it runs into a moral difficulty, a moral impossibility, a moral incongruity. So that won't work. Well, perhaps they were deceived. Well, then, if so, by whom? Yes, Jürgen.
I quote the Jewish scholar of New Testament, who died some years ago, was not a Christian, and he has written this subject that to believe in self-deceit, he has the fine sentence, that would be a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself.
Yeah, that's right. That's Hume, exactly Hume. Yeah, that's more or less what Hume says in this quote.
He said it's unbelievable. These people, they were not philosophers, nor theologians, didn't study dialectic theology or all these things. Something must have happened which changed, what were the reasons of the reactions of the disciples. And Lapid here wrote, we cannot exclude the possibility of a bodily resurrection of these persons.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, because I've read that thing about Pinchas Lapid in your writings, and it just occurs to me, speaking now, that it fits exactly into Hume's criterion. Hume says, I reject the bigger miracle. That's what Lapid is saying. But the whole thing gets rather spoiled when Hume then, who seems to be very even-handed, let's look at the evidence, let's reject the bigger miracle, the very next paragraph to that, he says that he's not content with an even-handed assessment of evidence, because he's determined the verdict against miracles in advance. Let me read you the next paragraph. It's not in the thing I gave out to you. He says he's been far too liberal in imagining that the testimony on which a miracle is founded may amount to an entire proof, since there never was a miraculous event established on so full an evidence. So having said that, we should examine it on the basis of evidence. We should ask ourselves, is it a bigger miracle if the opposite of this is the case? And if it is, then we should accept it. He says, but there never was a miracle that had full evidence of this kind. So it seems to me, and I've summed up the logic of the argument like this. 1, this is Hume's argument. The laws of nature describe the irregularities. 2, miracles are singularities, exceptions to the regular course of nature, and so are exceedingly rare. 3, evidence for what is regular and repeatable must always be more than evidence for what is singular and unrepeatable. 4, the wise man bases his belief on the weight of evidence. 5, therefore no wise man can believe in a miracle. That is what Hume is actually saying. So he's first open to the theoretical possibility that it might occur, provided the evidence is strong enough. But he then reveals that he's totally convinced that never can be strong enough evidence of the kind he requires to substantiate a miracle. So he's begging the question, and
he's trying to turn a positive into a negative, isn't he? He's saying that all the positive evidence, or these laws of nature can actually turn around to saying, and nothing else can ever happen. It's like, all the positive evidence that I have that tea comes from China, there's loads and loads of evidence that tea comes from China, so tea can't possibly come from India.
Yes. I've always seen white swans, so black swans don't exist.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. That's the induction problem, really. That's absolutely right. Yes, Alexander.
Actually, to accept a miracle, there would have to be more evidence that miracles occur than that the laws of nature hold. Yes,
That's interesting. Yes, that's right. That's a very interesting way of putting it.
Then there wouldn't be any laws anymore. So it's somehow a circular argument.
That's right. That's right. Now, in connection with this, you may notice on this page that Anthony Flew, who used to be very keen on Hume's arguments, I have just heard during this conference that he has become a theist. You've heard that, have you?
Yes. Anthony Flew has become a theist, and I believe it's true to say he's been seen going to Quaker meetings.
Well, that's very interesting, because I have a quote here from Anthony Flew, who's a very distinguished philosopher, in Reading, isn't he? Around Reading? Lives there, yeah. He argues that the proposition reporting the alleged occurrence of the miracle will be singular, particular, and in the past tense. And his deduction from that is, since in any case propositions of this sort cannot be tested directly, the evidence for them will always be immeasurably weaker in logical strength than the evidence for general and repeatable propositions. That sounds very impressive until you apply it to science. Because science of the past is full of singularities, like the whole origin of the universe. And if you take Flew's interpretation of Hume, you could not believe in a singularity like that of the origin of the universe, for example. So there's something happening there, because scientists believe in their model of the universe because of the evidence. You see, this is a very interesting thing. This whole presumption of the uniformity of nature has to be cast aside, at least for most physicists, when it comes to the origin of the universe. And it's a very interesting business that the evidence forces out a singularity. And Stephen Hawking's original statement about the singularity was, there's a singularity in space-time at which the laws of physics break down. Now, I'm aware, and Adam can tell us about it if he likes, that in recent days there are enormous attempts to get round that singularity. And now Scientific American last issue was full of a whole scenario of no beginning, and inflations and contractions and all kinds of things. But it's very interesting that, leaving that aside, that the physics community didn't collapse when the evidence, based on certain assumptions of uniformity, forced them to say that uniformity breaks down at the beginning. It's interesting. So, if I argue, for example, that another break in the uniformity is the origin of life, for example, why should that be thought so strange? In the sense of, could there not possibly be evidence for that as well? Could it be that in biology, just as physics, looking at what actually is there, microwave background expansion and all this kind of thing, leads you logically to deny the uniformity of nature? So perhaps the uniformity is also broken at the point of the origin of life, and is provably so. We ought to be open to that theoretical possibility. I mean, the thing that interests me about Scripture, I think I mentioned it this morning, is that if you take the Genesis story, the number of breaks in the uniformity is relatively limited, and the sequence stops. It's a limited, defined set of 5 or 6, and God said, stop. It doesn't happen anymore in that sense. So Flu's argument appears to be rather deficient. And I would like to suggest that Popper's criteria brought in here can be quite useful in the sense that Hume's position does not appear to be falsifiable, because none of them can conceive of an observation which would prove their contention false. It's inconceivable that there could be evidence for a miracle. But of course, what they should have done, and this is a point that Bill Craig emphasizes very strongly in one of his, I think it's he who emphasizes this, is to weigh the probability of the resurrection of Jesus against the probability of the tomb being empty on any other hypothesis than the one that he rose from the dead. And they don't appear to have done that. The rejection of ideas that don't conform with experience would lead not only to the rejection of the resurrection, but of key ideas in physics. For example, counterintuitive notions of quantum mechanics.
I don't know why, but as a physicist, if I just assume myself to be a physicist without knowing anything about fate and so on, I get some hurts in my stomach when I hear that. Because it's so, probabilities about a singular event in the past, how would you calculate probabilities about a past event?
I think the word probability is not being used here in a strict mathematical sense. I think it's rather the likelihood. Look at the situation. What is the likelihood? Weighing it up, you can't calculate it, can you? You could only get a kind of perception, a feel for it. For example, if I say to you, now what is the probability of the Apostle John being a liar? Well, how could you begin to calculate that? But that's a moral perception, isn't it? At this level, we're dealing with perceptions. But we could use that kind of language. But we're not saying, well, 1 in 10 million and 3.
That's it. But it doesn't have to be quantifiable.
No.
It can be rationally persuasive.
Exactly. That's a
judgment.
yeah. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think we need to be aware of that. We're not. You're not into the business of quantification.
Is this a historical question? Sorry? It's a historical evidential question rather than a, what's the probability of this quantified system in scientific terms?
Yeah, but the problem is when Bill Craig talks about that, he uses P and then all the logical symbols, and a mathematician or a physicist would say, so now what's this quantifying it if you call variables and so on. So I think we need to be careful which language to use.
It's the way that philosophers use symbolic logic as opposed to the way that
plausibility would be a good.
Yeah, it is. I think one of the things is, I mean, this is a great question, isn't it? Swinburne's very keen on it. Using Bayes' theorem, for example, in working out probabilities. What's the probability that there is a God, granted there's a fine-tuned universe? And you start off with the probability that there's a God, and the probability that there's a fine-tuned universe if there isn't a God, and then you put it into Bayes' theorem, and you get a figure out, and it's always very high, 0.99, and so on and so forth. But it depends on the things you put in at the beginning. There's nothing wrong with Bayes' theorem. But the big debate, and people take very different sides in it, is how can you assign probabilities to events in the past, you see. But we need to be on the informal level. As C.S. Lewis once beautifully pointed out, I think in his book, In Miracles, he said, remember, the history of the whole universe has only happened once, so it's highly improbable. So we need to be careful with that, and quantifications and symbols and so on. And Peter's right. You tend to get the philosophers using the symbols not quite the same way as the mathematicians do. Yeah. There is a very real communication problem there. So the next point, at least the next point I have here, we must come towards an end here, is that the real issue is, it seems to me, that miracles, they threaten the foundations of naturalism. That's the bottom line. Hume and Flu's axiom that their starting point is that nature is all there is and there's nothing and no one outside it that could intervene. That's the bottom line. In other words, their viewpoint is conditioned by their philosophy. That is their concept of the uniformity of nature. And it is simply a belief, not a consequence of scientific investigation. And the interesting thing is, and it was Peter that said it, I think, earlier, that Christians, and you did, Adam, Christians can argue that it's only belief in a creator that gives us solid ground for believing in the uniformity of nature. Atheism actually undermines that belief. But Christianity at the same time gives us the freedom. Yes, you see. And the quote from Lewis, I think, is superb. If all that exists in nature, the great mindless interlocking event, if our own deepest convictions are merely the byproducts of an irrational process, then clearly there's not the slightest ground for supposing that our sense of fitness and our consequent faith in uniformity tell us anything about a reality external to ourselves. Our convictions are simply a fact about us, like the colour of our hair. If naturalism is true, we've no reason to trust our conviction that nature is uniform. It can be trusted only if quite a different metaphysic is true. If the deepest thing in reality, the fact which is the source of all other facthood, is a thing in some degree like ourselves, if it is a rational spirit, and we derive our rational spirituality from it, then indeed our conviction can be trusted. Our repugnance to disorder is derived from nature's creator and ours. Well, if you haven't read C.S. Lewis and Miracles, then you should.
And may I recommend on that one to note that within the philosophical community, Lewis is actually this argument has recently been revived in various forms by a number of professional philosophers, such as Alvin Plantinga in a probability sense, William Hasker in a book on the philosophy of mind, is called The Immersion of the Self, and Victor Reppert in a book called C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea, published by RMP.
And which is on the shelf downstairs. It's gone, has it? Yeah. Plantinga is a very interesting contemporary philosopher because my colleagues at Oxford know him well, and he rates as one of the world's outstanding philosophers. So it's very interesting that you have an evangelical Christian at that level in philosophy. I closed this, and I'm going to close now to give us time to go over for a meal. Bertrand Russell's lovely comment on Hume. Hume's philosophy, whether true or false, represents the bankruptcy of 18th century reasonableness. He starts out like Locke with the intention of being sensible and empirical, taking nothing on trust, but seeking whatever instruction is to be obtained from experience and observation. But having a better intellect than Locke's, a great acuteness in analysis, and a smaller capacity for accepting uncomfortable inconsistencies, he arrives at the disastrous conclusion that from experience and observation nothing is to be learnt. There is no such thing as a rational belief. If we believe that fire warms or water refreshes, 'tis only because it costs us too much pains to think otherwise. We cannot help believing, but no belief can be grounded in reason. The growth of unreason throughout the 19th century and what has passed of the 20th is a natural sequel to Hume's destruction of empiricism. It's interesting to reflect that I suspect that part of the reason was Hume's adoption of the representative theory of perception, what it means to know, that you cannot know things in themselves. But that would lead us into a vast discussion going back to Kant and so on. Well, folks, thank you for joining in, the faithful who stayed to the end, and I've enjoyed the chat. I hope you have. And thank you for making it lively.